The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain by John Henry Ingram. Section 1. Preface. This collection of strange stories and weird traditions has not been compiled with a view of creating un frisson nouveau, but to serve as a guide to the geography of Ghostland, a handbook to the haunted houses of Great Britain. Many historic tales of apparitions and supernaturally disturbed dwellings are embedded in British literature, are frequently alluded to in journalistic and other publications, and are known to everybody by name, but by name only. Most people have heard of the Demon of Tedworth, the Lord Lyttelton ghost story, and other celebrated narratives of the uncanny kind, but it is rare to find anyone able to furnish particulars of them. To enable them to do this is the raison d'être of this work. The number of dwellings reputed to be haunted is much greater than is commonly supposed, and although steam engines and speculative builders are rapidly diminishing these lingering relics of the past, Dr. Mackay's words, in his Extraordinary Popular Delusions, anent this theme, are still applicable. Who has not either seen or heard of some house, shut up and uninhabitable, fallen into decay, and looking dusty and dreary, whence at midnight strange sounds have been heard to issue, the rattling of chains, and the groaning of perturbed spirits, a house that people have thought it unsafe to pass after dark, and which has remained for years without a tenant, and which no tenant would occupy even were he paid to do so. There are hundreds of such houses in England at the present day, which are marked with the mark of fear, places for the timid to avoid, and the pious to bless themselves at, and ask protection from, as they pass, the abodes of ghosts and evil spirits. There are many such houses in London, and if any vain boaster of their march of intellect would but take the trouble to find them out and count them, he would be convinced that intellect must yet make some enormous strides before such old superstitions can be eradicated. Although Dr. Mackay may not have exaggerated the number of places having the discredit of being haunted, particulars of the manner of the haunting are generally difficult to obtain. Nearly every ancient castle or time-worn hall bears the reputation of being thus troubled, but in a very large majority of such cases no evidence is forthcoming, not even the ghost of a tradition. Guide-books, topographical works, even the loquacious custodian, where there is one, of the building, fail to furnish any details. Were it otherwise, instead of one modest volume, a many-tomed cyclopedia would be necessary. To mention here separately the many sources whence the information contained in this compilation has been drawn would be impossible, and as in most instances the authority for each story has been specified under its respective heading, would be needless. But still thanks are due and are hereby tendered to those authors whose books have been made use of, and to those noblemen and gentlemen who have aided the work by their friendly information. In conclusion, it should be remarked that authors and correspondents having, as far as possible, been allowed to tell their tales after their own fashion, the editor does not hold himself responsible for their opinions. Had he ever entertained any belief whatever in supernatural manifestations, as evidently many of his authorities do, the compilation of this work would have effectually cured him of such mental weakness, but it must be added, no story has been included the incidents of which have been proved to have been the result of palpable deception, or for which any natural explanation has been found. Trusting that his Psychomanteum will exercise no worse effect upon his readers than it has had upon its compiler, he leaves it to their judgment. John H. Ingram.
Section 2. Allenbank. In North Britain, haunted castles and hereditary apparitions appear to have lingered more persistently and to have had longer leases of existence than they have had in the less romantically inclined southern portion of the island. One of the most noted Scotch spirits attendant upon a certain family is that known as Purlin Jean, so called from a species of lace made of thread with which this spectre is bedecked. Purlin Jean's continuous and demonstrative annoyances at Allenbank, a seat of the Stuarts, a family of Scotch baronets, are so thoroughly believed in and widely known that it has been found difficult to obtain a tenant for the place. Mr. Charles Kirkpatrick Sharp, the antiquary, has furnished the following explanatory account of Pearlin Jean's hauntings at Allenbank, together with the cause of her doing so. "In my youth," says Mr. Sharp, "Pearlin Jean was the most remarkable ghost in Scotland, and my terror when a child. Our old nurse, Jenny Blackadder, had been a servant at Allenbank, and often heard her rustling in silks up and down stairs and along the passages. She never saw her, but her husband did. She was a Frenchwoman, whom the first baronet of Allenbank (Footnote: Sir Robert Stewart was created a baronet in the year 1687), then Mr. Stewart, met with at Paris during his tour to finish his education as a gentleman. Some people said she was a nun, in which case she must have been a sister of charity, as she appears not to have been confined to a cloister. After some time young Stewart either became faithless to the lady, or was suddenly recalled to Scotland by his parents, and had got into his carriage at the door of the hotel, when his Dido unexpectedly made her appearance, and, stepping on the fore-wheel of the coach to address her lover, he ordered the postillion to drive on, the consequence of which was that the lady fell, and one of the wheels going over her forehead killed her. In a dusky autumnal evening, when Mr. Stewart drove under the arched gateway of Allenbank, he perceived Pearlin Jean sitting on the top, her head and shoulders covered with blood. After this, for many years, the house was haunted. Doors shut and opened with great noise at midnight. The rustling of silks and pattering of high-heeled shoes were heard in bedrooms and passages. Nurse Jenny said that there were 7 ministers called in together at one time to lay the spirit, but they did no mickle good, my dear. The picture of the ghost was hung between those of her lover and his lady, and kept her comparatively quiet, but when taken away she became worse-natured than ever. This portrait was in the present Sir J.G.'s possession. I am unwilling to record its fate. The ghost was designated Pearlin, from always wearing a great quantity of that sort of lace. Nurse Jenny told me that when Thomas Blackadder was her lover, I remember Thomas very well, they made an assignation to meet one moonlight night in the orchard at Allenbank. True Thomas, of course, was the first comer, and seeing a female figure in a light-coloured dress at some distance, he ran forward with open arms to embrace his Jenny, when lo and behold, as he neared the spot where the figure stood, it vanished, and presently he saw it again at the very end of the orchard, a considerable way off. Thomas went home in a fright, but Jenny, who came last and saw nothing, forgave him, and they were married. Many years after this, about the year 1790, 2 ladies paid a visit at Allenbank. I think the house was then let, and passed the night there. They had never heard a word about the ghost, but they were disturbed the whole night with something walking backwards and forwards in their bedchamber. This I had from the best authority. To this account may be added that a housekeeper called Betty Norrie, who in more recent times lived many years at Allenbank, positively averred that she and many other persons had frequently seen Pearlin Jean, and, moreover, stated that they were so used to her as to be no longer alarmed at the noises she made. Section 3. Bear Hall. The communicator of the story hereafter detailed was described in Notes and Queries as a well-informed young lady, and as one who firmly believed what she stated. Moreover, it was further remarked that, previous to her seeing the apparition she tells of, She had heard nothing whatever of any story or legend that could have put it into her mind or have caused her to dream of it, whilst the corroborative evidence of her hostess and her household would put all idea of a dream or hallucination out of the question. In consequence of the correspondence this story called forth, a contributor to Notes and Queries made it fairly evident that the Bear Hall visited by the narrator was identical with Torrisholme Hall, the property of J. Lodge of Bear, in the county of Lancashire, Esquire. A short time ago, states the relator of this story, I went with a friend to pay a visit to a family in the neighbourhood of Lancaster. We were very cordially received at Bear Hall by the hostess, who assigned to our use a spacious bedroom with old-fashioned furniture, and we noticed particularly an old press. My companion and myself retired to bed and enjoyed a good night's rest. I happened to awaken at about 5 o'clock, it being a bright summer's morning, broad daylight, and, to my great surprise, saw distinctly within a few feet of the old-fashioned bed an old gentleman seated in an arm-chair, earnestly gazing at me with a pleasant expression of countenance. I was not alarmed, but surprised, as I had locked the door when I went to bed, and, considering it a mental delusion, I closed my eyes for a moment and looked again. In the interval the old gentleman had moved his chair and placed its back against the chamber door. He was seated in it as before, and gazed at me with rather an amused expression. I turned round to look at my companion. She was fast asleep. I immediately awoke her and requested her to look across the room at the door. She could see nothing, neither could I. The old gentleman had gone. When I told her what I had seen, she got out of bed in haste. We both quitted the room in great alarm and went to the bedroom of our hostess, who admitted us, and there we remained until it was time to dress. The lady asked us if we had opened the old press wardrobe. It appeared we had. "Oh," said she, "it is only James Bear, my uncle, or great-uncle. He does not like anyone but myself to examine his ancient clothes, or interfere with his press. He frequently joins me in the house, and some of the other members of the family also, but they don't like him. With me he often converses." I found, concludes the narrator, who does not appear to have had any further encounter with James Bear's apparition, if any of the rooms or closets were locked at night, they were found open in the morning, and our hostess thought nothing of it. Section 4. Barbie. Dr. Lee, in his work on Glimpses of the Supernatural, furnishes a curious account of the discovery of hidden treasure by the agency of an apparition. He does not appear to entertain the slightest doubts as to the correctness of his information in this case, and indeed declares, as will be seen later on by the reader, that the circumstances recorded were completely verified. The events to which Dr. Lee refers are stated to have occurred at Barbie, a village of between 600 and 700 inhabitants, in the county of Northampton, situated about 8 miles from Rugby and a little more than 5 miles from Daventry. A house in this small village was, until recently, reputed to be haunted, and this in the following manner, according to the authority above referred to. An old woman of the name of Webb, a native of the place, and above the usual height, died on March 3rd, 1851, at 2 a.m., aged 67. Late in life she had married a man of some means, who, having predeceased her, left her his property, so that she was in good circumstances. Her chief and notorious characteristic, however, was excessive penuriousness, she being remarkably miserly in her habits. and it is believed by many in the village that she thus shortened her days. Two of her neighbours, women of the names of Griffin and Holding, nursed her during her last illness, and her nephew, Mr. Hart, a farmer in the village, supplied her temporal needs, in whose favour she had made a will, by which she bequeathed to him all her possessions. About a month after the funeral, Mrs. Holding, who, with her uncle, lived next door to the house of the deceased, which had been entirely shut up since the funeral, was alarmed and astonished at hearing loud and heavy thumps against the partition wall, and especially against the door of a cupboard in the room wall, while other strange noises, like the dragging of furniture about the rooms, though all the furniture had been removed, and the house was empty. These were chiefly heard about 2 o'clock in the morning. Early in the month of April, a family of the name of Ackleton, much needing a residence, took the deceased woman's house, the only one in the village vacant, and bringing their goods and chattels, proceeded to inhabit it. The husband was often absent, but he and his wife occupied the room in which Mrs. Webb had died, while their daughter, a girl of about 10 years of age, slept in a small bed in the corner. Violent noises in the night were heard about 2 o'clock, thumps, tramps, and tremendous crashes, as if all the furniture had been collected together and then violently banged onto the floor. One night, at 2 a.m., the parents were suddenly awakened by the violent screams of the child. "Mother, mother, there's a tall woman standing by my bed, a-shaking her head at me." The parents could see nothing, so did their best to quiet and compose the child. At 4 o'clock they were awakened by the child's screams, for she had seen the woman again. In fact, she appeared to her no less than 7 times on 7 subsequent nights. Mrs. Ackleton, during her husband's absence, having engaged her mother to sleep with her one night, was suddenly aroused at the same hour of 2 by a strange and unusual light in her room. Looking up, she saw quite plainly the spirit of Mrs. Webb, which moved towards her with a gentle, appealing manner, as though it would have said, "Speak, speak." The spectre appeared likewise to a Mrs. Radbourne, a Mrs. Griffiths, and a Mrs. Holding. They assert that luminous balls of light seemed to go up and towards a trapdoor in the ceiling which led to the roof of the cottage. Each person who saw it testified likewise to hearing a low, unearthly moaning noise, strange and unnatural alike, but somewhat similar in character to the moans of the woman in her death agony. The subject was, of course, discussed, and Mrs. Ackleton suggested that its appearance might not impossibly be connected with the existence of money hoarded up in the roof, an idea which may have arisen from the miserly habits of the dead woman. The hint having been given to and taken by her nephew, Mr. Hart, the farmer, he proceeded to the house, and with Mrs. Ackleton's personal help made a search. The loft above was totally dark, but by the aid of a candle there was discovered, firstly, a bundle of old writings, old deeds as they turned out to be, and afterwards a large bag of gold and banknotes, out of which the nephew took a handful of sovereigns and exhibited them to Mrs. Ackleton. But the knockings, moanings, strange noises, and other disturbances did not cease upon this discovery. They did cease, however, when Mr. Hart, having found that certain debts were owing by her, carefully and scrupulously paid them. So much for the account of the haunted house at Barby. The circumstances detailed were most carefully investigated by Sir Charles Isham and other gentlemen in the neighbourhood, and the conclusion they arrived at was that the above facts were completely verified by the evidence laid before them.
Section 5. Beaminster School. In 1774, the Gentleman's Magazine printed the following narrative, prefacing it with these words: "The following very singular story comes well authenticated." In many respects, the story may be deemed unique in the history of the supernatural. The apparition appears in broad daylight and is seen by 5 children, one of whom did not even know the individual it represented when alive, and yet proved its identity by a wonderful piece of circumstantial evidence. The intense pathos of the unfortunate and evidently murdered lad, reappearing amid the scenes of his childish occupations, and where he had been wont to play with those boys who now could only look upon him as a passing shadow, is most suggestive. "The School of Beaminster," says the account, "is held in a gallery of the parish church, to which there is a distinct entrance from the churchyard. Every Saturday, the key of it is delivered to the clerk of the parish by one or the other of the schoolboys. On Saturday, June the 22nd, 1728, the master had dismissed his lads as usual. 12 of them loitered about in the churchyard to play at ball. It was just about noon. After a short space, 4 of the lads returned into the school to search for old pens, and were startled by hearing in the church a noise which they described as that produced by striking a brass pan. They immediately ran to their playfellows in the churchyard and told them of it. They came to the conclusion that someone was in hiding in order to frighten them, and they all went back into the school together to discover who it was, but could not find anyone. As they were returning to their sport, on the stairs that led into the churchyard, they heard in the school a second noise. Terrified at that, they ran round the church, and when at the belfry, or west door, they heard what seemed to them the sound of someone preaching, which was succeeded by another sound as of a congregation singing psalms. Both of these noises lasted but a short time. With the thoughtlessness of youth, the lads soon resumed their sport, and after a short time, one of them went into the school for his book, when he saw a coffin lying on one of the benches, only about 6 feet away. Surprised at this, he ran off and told his playfellows what he had seen, on which they all thronged to the school door, whence 5 of the 12 saw the apparition of John Daniel, who had been dead more than 7 weeks, sitting at some distance from the coffin, further in the school. All of them saw the coffin, and it was conjectured that why all did not see the apparition was because the door was so narrow they could not all approach it together. The first who knew it to be the apparition of their deceased schoolfellow was Daniel's half-brother, and he, on seeing it, cried out, "There sits old John, with just such a coat on as I have." In the lifetime of the deceased boy, the half-brothers were usually clothed alike. "With a pen in his hand, and a book before him, and a coffin by him. I'll throw a stone at him." The other boys tried to stop him, but he threw the stone, as he did so saying, "Take it!" upon which the apparition immediately disappeared. The immense excitement this created in the place may be imagined. The lads, whose ages ranged between 9 and 12, were all magisterially examined by Colonel Broadrep, and all agreed in their relation of the circumstances, even to the hinges of the coffin, whilst their description of the coffin tallied exactly with that the deceased lad had been buried in. One of the lads who saw the apparition was quite 12 years of age, and was a quiet, sedate lad for his age. He entered the school after the deceased boy had left it, on account of illness about a fortnight before his death, and had never seen Daniel in his lifetime. This lad, on examination, gave an exact description of the person of the deceased, and took especial notice of one thing about the apparition which the other boys had not observed, and that was, it had a white cloth or rag bound round one of its hands. The woman who laid out the corpse of John Daniel for interment deposed on oath that she took such a white cloth from its hand, it having been put on the boy's hand, he being lame of it, about 4 days or so before his death. Daniel's body had been found in an obscure place in a field, at about a furlong distant from his mother's house, and had been buried without an inquest, in consequence of his mother alleging that the lad had been subject to fits. After the appearance of the apparition, the body was disinterred, a coroner's inquest held, and a verdict returned to the effect that the boy had been strangled. This verdict appears to have been mainly arrived at in consequence of the depositions of 2 women of good repute, that 2 days after the corpse was found, they saw it, and discovered a black list round its neck, and likewise of the joiner who put the body into the coffin, and who had an opportunity of observing it, as the shroud was not put on in the usual way, but was in 2 pieces, one laid under and the other over the body. A chirurgeon who gave evidence could not or would not positively affirm to the jury that there was any dislocation of the neck. So far as can be learnt, no steps were taken to bring anyone to justice on account of the suggested death by violence of the lad.
Section 7. Botheddon. In the 2nd volume of Hitchen's History of Cornwall is given in extenso a most remarkable account of an apparition that is believed to have appeared in that county. The scene of its appearance was a place called Botheddon, or Botheddon, in the parish of South Petherwin, near Launceston. Various authors have alluded to this marvellous and, all things considered, inexplicable story, but as Hitchen appears to have derived his account direct from one of the persons chiefly concerned, that is to say, from the Reverend John Ruddle, headmaster of the grammar school at Launceston, vicar of Altonan, and prebendary of Exeter, it is better to follow him. Young Mr. Bligh, says Hitchen, a lad of bright parts and of no common attainments, became on a sudden pensive, dejected, and melancholy. His friends, observing the change without being able to discover the cause, attributed his behaviour to laziness, an aversion to school, or to some other motive which they suspected he was ashamed to avow. He was, however, induced to inform his brother, after some time, that in a field through which he passed to and from school, that is to say, to and from Launceston Grammar School, of which, as has already been observed, Mr. Ruddle was headmaster, he was invariably met by an apparition of a woman whom he personally knew while living, and who had been dead about 8 years. Young Bligh is said to have been at this time about 16. Ridicule, threats, and persuasions were alike used in vain by the family to induce him to dismiss these absurd ideas. Mr. Ruddle was, however, sent for, to whom the lad ingenuously communicated the time, manner, and frequency of this appearance. It was in a field called Higher Broomfield. The apparition, he said, appeared dressed in female attire, met him 2 or 3 times while he passed through the field, glided hastily by him, but never spoke. He had thus been occasionally met about 2 months before he took any particular notice of it. At length the appearance became more frequent, meeting him both morning and evening, but always in the same field, yet invariably moving out of the path when it came close to him. He often spoke, but could never get any reply. To avoid this unwelcome visitor, he forsook the field, and went to school and returned from it through a lane, in which place, between the quarry peg and nursery, it always met him. Unable to disbelieve the evidence of his own senses, or to obtain credit with any of his family, he prevailed upon Mr. Ruddle to accompany him to the place. I arose, says this clergyman, the next morning, and went with him. The field to which he led me I guessed to be about 20 acres, in an open country, and about 3 furlongs from any house. We went into the field, and had not gone a third part before the spectrum, in the shape of a woman, with all the circumstances he had described the day before, so far as the suddenness of its appearance and transition would permit me to discover, passed by. I was a little surprised at it, and though I had taken up a firm resolution to speak to it, I had not the power, nor durst I look back. Yet I took care not to show any fear to my pupil and guide, and therefore, telling him that I was satisfied in the truth of his statement, we walked to the end of the field and returned, nor did the ghost meet us that time but once. On the 27th of July 1665 I went to the haunted field by myself, and walked the breadth of it without any encounter. I then returned and took the other walk, and then the spectre appeared to me, much about the same place in which I saw it when the young gentleman was with me. It appeared to move swifter than before, and seemed to be about 10 feet from me, on my right hand, insomuch that I had not time to speak to it, as I had determined with myself beforehand. The evening of this day, the parents, the son, and myself being in the chamber where I lay, I proposed to them our going all together to the place next morning. We accordingly met at the stile we had appointed. Thence we all 4 walked into the field together. We had not gone more than half the field before the ghost made its appearance. It then came over the stile just before us, and moved with such rapidity that by the time we had gone 6 or 7 steps it passed by. I immediately turned my head and ran after it, with the young man by my side. We saw it pass over the stile at which we entered, and no farther. I stepped upon the hedge at one place, and the young man at another, but we could discern nothing; whereas I do aver that the swiftest horse in England could not have conveyed himself out of sight in that short space of time. 2 things I observed in this day's appearance. First, a spaniel dog, which had followed the company unregarded, barked and ran away as the spectrum passed by, whence it is easy to conclude that it was not our fear or fancy which made the apparition. Secondly, the motion of the spectrum was not gradatim, or by steps, or moving of the feet, but by a kind of gliding, as children upon ice, or as a boat down a river, which punctually answers the description the ancients give of the motion of these lemurs. This ocular evidence clearly convinced, but withal strangely affrighted, the old gentleman and his wife. They well knew this woman, Dorothy Durand, in her lifetime, were at her burial, and now plainly saw her features in this apparition. The next morning, being Thursday, I went very early by myself, and walked for about an hour's space in meditation and prayer in the field next adjoining. Soon after 5 I stepped over the stile into the haunted field, and had not gone above 30 or 40 paces before the ghost appeared at the further stile. I spoke to it in some short sentences with a loud voice, whereupon it approached me, but slowly, and when I came near it moved not. I spoke again, and it answered in a voice neither audible nor very intelligible. I was not in the least terrified, and therefore persisted until it spoke again, and gave me satisfaction. But the work could not be finished at this time. Whereupon the same evening, an hour after sunset, it met me again near the same place, and after a few words on each side, it quietly vanished, and neither doth appear now, nor hath appeared since, nor ever will more to any man's disturbance. The discourse in the morning lasted about a quarter of an hour. These things are true, concludes the Reverend John Ruddle, and I know them to be so, with as much certainty as eyes and ears can give me, and until I can be persuaded that my senses all deceive me about their proper objects, and by that persuasion deprive me of the strongest inducement to believe the Christian religion, I must and will assert that the things contained in this paper are true.
Section 8. Bowood. In the popular memoirs of Mrs. Schimmelpenninck, the well-known authoress, a curious story connected with Bowood, the seat of the Marquis of Lansdowne, is related as having occurred whilst the celebrated Dr. Priestley was librarian there to Lord Shelburne. One day, says Mrs. Schimmelpenninck, Mr. Petty, the precocious and gifted youth, sent for Dr. Priestley, Lord Shelburne, Mr. Petty's father, being then absent, I think, in London. When the doctor entered, Mr. Petty told him he had passed a very restless night, and had been much disturbed by uncomfortable dreams, which he wished to relate to Dr. Priestley, hoping that, by doing so, the painful impression would pass away. He then said he dreamed he had been very unwell, when suddenly the whole household was in preparation for a journey. He was too ill to sit up, but was carried lying down in the carriage. His surprise was extreme in seeing carriage after carriage in an almost interminable procession. He was alone and could not speak. He could only gaze in astonishment. The procession at last wound slowly off. After pursuing the road for many miles towards London, it at last appeared to stop at the door of a church. It was the church at High Wycombe, which is the burial place of the Shelburne family. It seemed, in Mr. Petty's dream, that he entered, or rather was carried, into the church. He looked back. He saw the procession which followed him was in black, and that the carriage from which he had been taken bore the semblance of a hearse. Here the dream ended, and he awoke. Dr. Priestley told him that his dream was the result of a feverish cold, and that the impression would soon pass off. Nevertheless, he thought it best to send for the family medical attendant. The next day Mr. Petty was much better. On the third day he was completely convalescent, so that the doctor permitted him to leave his room. But as it was in January, and illness was prevalent, he desired him on no account to leave the house, and, with that precaution, took his leave. Late the next afternoon the medical man was returning from his other patients. His road lay by the gates of Bowood, and as Lord Shelburne was away, he thought he might as well call to see Mr. Petty and enforce his directions. What was his surprise when he had passed the lodge to see the youth himself, without his hat, playfully running to meet him. The doctor was much astonished, as it was bitterly cold and the ground covered with snow. He rode towards Mr. Petty to rebuke him for his imprudence, when suddenly he disappeared. Whither, he knew not, but he seemed instantaneously to vanish. The doctor thought it very extraordinary, but that probably the youth had not wished to be found transgressing orders, and he rode on to the house. There he learnt that Mr. Petty had just expired.
Section 9. The Bristol Vicarage. In 1846, certain strange doings were reported to be going on in an ancient residence in Bristol. The papers found the matter exciting such interest that they felt bound to notice it, but did so in a half-serious, half-sarcastic spirit, as the following excerpt from the Bristol Times will show. Under the heading of "A Ghost at Bristol," the journal named made this statement. We have this week a ghost story to relate. Yes, a real ghost story, and a ghost story without, as yet, any clue to its elucidation. After the dissolution of the Calendars, their ancient residence, adjoining and almost forming a part of All Saints' Church, Bristol, was converted into a vicarage house, and it is still, in 1846, called by that name, although the incumbents have for many years ceased to reside there. The present occupants are Mr. and Mrs. Jones, a sexton and sextoness of the church, and 1 or 2 lodgers. And it is to the former and their servant maid that the strange visitor has made his appearance, causing such terror by his nightly calls that all 3 have determined upon quitting the premises, if indeed they have not already carried their resolution into effect. Mr. and Mrs. Jones' description of the disturbance, as given to the landlord, on whom they called in great consternation, is as distinct as any ghost story could be. The nocturnal visitor is heard walking about the house when the inhabitants are in bed, and Mr. Jones, who is a man of by no means nervous constitution, declares he has several times seen a light flickering on one of the walls. Mrs. Jones is equally certain that she has heard a man with creaking shoes walking in the bedroom above her own, when no man was on the premises, or at least ought not to be, and was nearly killed with fright. To the servant maid, however, was vouchsafed the unenvied honour of seeing this restless night visitor. She declares she has repeatedly had her bedroom door unbolted at night between the hours of 12 and 2 o'clock, the period when such beings usually make their promenades, by something in human semblance. She cannot particularize his dress, but describes it as something antique and of a fashion lang syne, and to some extent corresponding to that of the ancient calendars, the former inhabitants of the house. She further says he is a whiskered gentleman, we give her own words, which whiskered gentleman had gone the length of shaking her bed, and, she believes, would have shaken herself also, but that she invariably puts her head under the clothes when she sees him approach. Mrs. Jones declares she believes in the appearance of the whiskered gentleman, and she had made up her mind the night before she called on her landlord to leap out of the window, and it is not a trifle that will make people leap out of the windows, as soon as he entered the room. The effect of the flickering light on Mr. Jones was quite terrific, causing excessive trembling and the complete doubling up of his whole body into a round ball like. As far as can be ascertained, no elucidation of this mysterious affair was ever forthcoming. Mrs. Crowe, to whose knowledge the account was brought, subsequently wrote to the editor of the Bristol Times and received a reply that the whole affair remains wrapped in the same mystery as when chronicled in the pages of the paper, and this statement was subsequently confirmed by Mrs. Jones. End of section 9. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 10. Cambridge. In the narrative about to be recited, the appearance of the apparition, and the coincidence of the date of death with its appearance, differ in no way from the usual records of such things. But the wonderful series of events by which the discrepancies between the official report and the spectral visits were ultimately explained render this story one of the most marvelous known. It is related by Robert Dale Owen in his famous Footfalls, wherein he declares that although in accordance with the wishes of the family, some of the names are merely represented by initials, they are all known to him. As, however, the name of the officer subsequently appeared in print, we shall not be committing any breach of courtesy or of good feeling in stating that Captain Jermyn Wheatcroft is the name in full. The story taken as a whole is so truly marvelous that it is deemed but just that it should be given verbatim from Owen's record, not abridging or altering a single footnote, nor omitting aught save a spiritual episode which does not affect the general narrative. The tale runs thus. In the month of September, 1857, Captain Jermyn Wheatcroft of the 6th Inniskilling Dragoons went out to India to join his regiment. His wife remained in England, residing at Cambridge. On the night between the 14th and the 15th of November, 1857, towards morning, she dreamed that she saw her husband looking anxious and ill, upon which she immediately awoke, much agitated. It was bright moonlight, and, looking up, she perceived the same figure standing by her bedside. He appeared in his uniform, the hands pressed across the breast, the hair dishevelled, the face very pale. His large dark eyes were fixed full upon her. Their expression was that of great excitement, and there was a peculiar contraction of the mouth, habitual to him when agitated. She saw him, even to each minute particular of his dress, as distinctively as she had ever done in her life, and she remembers to have noticed between the hands the white of the shirt bosom, unstained, however, with blood. The figure seems to bend forward, as if in pain, and to make an effort to speak, but there was no sound. It remained visible, the wife thinks, as long as a minute, and then disappeared. Her first idea was to ascertain if she actually awake. She rubbed her eyes with the sheet and felt that the touch was real. Her little nephew was in bed with her. She bent over the sleeping child and listened to its breathing. The sound was distinct, and she became convinced that what she had seen was no dream. It need hardly be added that she did not again go to sleep that night. Next morning she related all this to her mother, expressing her conviction, though she had noticed no marks of blood on his dress, that Captain Wheatcroft was either killed or grievously wounded. So fully impressed was she with the reality of that apparition that she thenceforth refused all invitations. A young friend urged her soon afterwards to go with her to a fashionable concert, reminding her that she had received from Malta, sent by her husband, a handsome dress cloak, which she had never yet worn. But she positively declined, declaring that, uncertain as she was whether she was not already a widow, she would never enter a place of amusement until she had letters from her husband, if indeed he still lived, of a later date than the 14th of November. It was on a Tuesday in the month of December 1857 that the telegram regarding the actual fate of Captain Wheatcroft was published in London. It was to the effect that he was killed before Lucknow on the 15th of November. This news, given in the morning paper, attracted the attention of Mr. Wilkinson, a London solicitor, who had in charge Captain Wheatcroft's affairs. When at a later period this gentleman met the widow, she informed him that she had been quite prepared for the melancholy news, but that she had felt sure her husband could not have been killed on the 15th of November, inasmuch as it was during the night between the 14th and the 15th that he appeared to her. Footnote: the difference of longitude between London and Lucknow being about 5 hours, 3 or 4 o'clock a.m. in London would be 8 or 9 o'clock a.m. at Lucknow. But it was in the afternoon, not in the morning, as will be seen in the sequel, that Captain Wheatcroft was killed. Had he fallen on the 15th, therefore, the apparition to his wife would have appeared several hours before the engagement in which he fell, and while he was yet alive and well. R. D. Owen. End of footnote. The certificate from the War Office, however, which it became Mr. Wilkinson's duty to obtain, confirmed the date given in the telegram, its tenor being as follows: Number 9579/1. War Office, 30th of January, 1858. These are to certify that it appears, by the records in this office, that Captain German Wheatcroft, of the 6th Dragoon Guards, was killed in action on the 15th of November, 1857. Footnote: into this certificate, of which I possess the original, an error has crept. Captain German Wheatcroft was of the 6th Inniskilling Dragoons, not of the 6th Dragoon Guards. R. D. Owen. End of footnote. Signed, B. Hawes. Mr. Wilkinson called at the office of Messrs. Cox and Greenwood, the army agents, to ascertain if there were no mistake in the certificate, but nothing there appeared to confirm any surmise of inaccuracy. Captain Wheatcroft's death was mentioned in 2 separate dispatches of Sir Colin Campbell, and in both the date corresponded with that given in the telegram. So matters rested until, in the month of March, 1858, the family of Captain Wheatcroft received from Captain G. C., then of the military train, a letter dated near Lucknow, on the 19th of December, 1857. This letter informed them that Captain Wheatcroft had been killed before Lucknow, while gallantly leading on the squadron, not on the 15th of November, as reported in Sir Colin Campbell's despatches, but on the 14th, in the afternoon. Captain C. was riding close by his side at the time he saw him fall. He was struck by a fragment of shell in the breast, and never spoke after he was hit. He was buried at the Dilkusha, and on a wooden cross, erected by his friend, Lieutenant R. of the 9th Lancers, at the head of his grave, are cut the initials G.W. and the date of his death, the 14th of November, 1857. Footnote: It was not in his own regiment, which was then at Meerut, that Captain Wheatcroft was serving at the time of his death. Immediately on arriving from England at Cawnpore, he had offered his services to Colonel Wilson of the 64th. They were at first declined, but finally accepted, and he joined the military train then starting for Lucknow. It was on their ranks that he fell. R.D. Owen. End of footnote. The War Office finally made the correction as to the date of death, but not until more than a year after the event occurred. Mr. Wilkinson, having occasionally to apply for an additional copy of the certificate in April 1857, found in it exactly the same words as that which I have given, only that the 14th of November had been substituted for the 15th. Footnote: The originals of both these certificates are in my possession, the first bearing date 30th January 1858, and certifying, as already shown, to the 15th, the second dated 5th April 1859, and testifying to the 14th. R.D. Owen. End of footnote. This extraordinary narrative was obtained by me direct from the parties themselves, says Owen. The widow of Captain Wheatcroft kindly consented to examine and correct the manuscript, and allowed me to inspect a copy of Captain C.'s letter, giving the particulars of her husband's death. To Mr. Wilkinson also the manuscript was submitted, and he assented to its accuracy so far as he is concerned. I have neglected no precaution, therefore, to obtain it for the warrant of authenticity. It is, perhaps, concludes Owen, the only example on record where the appearance of what is usually termed a ghost proved the means of correcting an erroneous date in the despatches of a commander-in-chief, and of detecting an inaccuracy in the certificate of a War Office. End of section 10.